So first off, Mr. Samuels, we would like to thank you for being here with us today. We would like to start off with just some information about before you entered the Army. So what were your parents' occupations?
Well, my father died when I was 9 years old. My mother operated a small ladies' ready-to-wear store in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, till I was 16 when we moved to St. Louis and I started college.
Okay. And you said you attended Washington?
Washington University.
Okay. Did you have any siblings?
Two older sisters, much older than me.
So neither of them would have entered the war as a...
No.
Okay. If so, neither of them served. What were their occupations?
Well, my youngest sister was 18 years older than I.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
so they were both married with families. They helped their husbands.
So then, we'd like to move on to your earlier days of service. When you first joined, which branch did you serve?
In the Army.
Did you enlist or were you drafted?
No, I was drafted. I had just been graduated from Washington U, and 3 weeks after that I was drafted.
When you were drafted, were you hesitant or were you willing to go into the...
Most people with any sense were not just hesitant, but scared.
Right, yeah.
I mean, we had heard about what was happening in Korea, and I didn't know of anyone who was eager to get involved in that. But I had applied for a direct commission in the Navy. It came through 9 days after I was drafted. But in order to accept it, I would have had to have signed up for a 3-year stint, or 4 years, I don't remember.
Okay.
And so I opted to just be an enlisted man. They tried to talk me into becoming an officer and going to OCS, but I wanted to get in and out as quickly as possible.
I can understand that. So, when you were departed for training camp, how were the early days of training?
Went to Fort Leonard Wood, which is not too far from, I lived in St. Louis at the time, where Washington U is located. And I went through basic training in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And it was, I would say, strenuous, hectic, what you might suspect basic training would be. But after I finished basic training, instead of sending me to Korea, they asked me to stay and become involved in regimental supply, which is what I did for a while. And then after a time, I was transferred to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. And I was in a holding company, a big holding detachment. There were 3,000 men in this building. We all figured we were going to be sent to Korea. And one day, a man came in and asked if there was a Harry Samuels around, and I said, yeah. He said, there's a Captain Fleming that wants to see you in the headquarters company. And I walked into this room, and this captain, who was a West Point grad, he with a real southern accent, he said, Mr. Samuels, I see where you got a degree from Washington University in political science. He said, I need somebody to teach TI&E, which is Troop Information and Education. It was the Army's attempt at propagandizing. In those days, it was the first war where our soldiers, the government was experiencing turncoats, men who just absolutely didn't want to be a part of fighting and participating in the government, in the service. And they were trained to hate, but they didn't hate the enemy, they hated their drill sergeants. And so my job was to give lectures twice a week to anyone of the rank of major on down. They had to attend these talks that I would give. And it was really anti-communist conversations that I would try to hold. I would begin the lectures with discussion of current events, and then we would lead into discussions of communism and what it was all about, why we were fighting in Korea, which was a tough job because I found it very difficult to understand why we were fighting in Korea at that time. This Captain Fleming really was a very interesting man. For some reason, he was very kind to me. And he more or less left me. I was a corporal at the time. And I would say, Captain, I need to go into Baltimore, which was not too far from Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and do some research in the library there. And he said, go ahead. Well, it was really a pleasant relationship. One day he asked me if I got a lot of information from the library that day. I said, oh, yes, sir. He said, the reason I ask is I saw you on television. I had gone to a ball game, and these people had a box, and they panned us, and he saw me. But he was very nice. He made life very pleasant for me. I told him that I wanted to go to the Armed Forces Information and Education School, which was at Fort Slocum, which was just a little island outside of New Rochelle, New York. You had to park a car and take a ferry boat to get to the island, and had outstanding speakers, justices of the Supreme Court. Have you all ever heard of Edward R. Murrow?
No, sir.
Edward R. Murrow was the premier commentator in those days, nationwide. He was the most well-known. And he participated with us. In fact, he sat next to me for 6 weeks. And it was a very nice situation. Every night I could take a train into Grand Central Station and go to any show on Broadway that I wanted to. And so my life during the Korean War was very pleasant. Interesting sidelight, years later I came to Memphis, and I helped, among other things, I helped develop what became the first membership department stores in Memphis. They were called Dixie Mart and Carondelet before your time. We were out of it in around 68, 70. But we had an architect. His name was Bob Fleming. His son is Scott Fleming. Some of you may have heard of Scott. He's an architect, very well known in Memphis. And Bob and Bob did all of the buildings that we created. And one day we were having lunch, and I said, Bob, this is a way out question to ask you, but does the name Eugene C. Fleming Jr. III, does that name mean anything to you? He said, of course, he's my cousin. He said, he's named after my father. That's this Gene Fleming that I had just luckily met, because he really made my life very pleasant. In fact, after I was out of the service, he and his wife came to see me in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Didn't have a close relationship because I was a corporal and he was a captain, and he was really my boss. But good Lord was looking over my shoulder.
Yes, sir. If you don't mind, would you elaborate more on what he had you do with the Captain Fleming had you do with the meetings? Like, what would you talk about?
Well, I would begin, first of all, I became a licensed projectionist. So they had training films, and I would show them. And as I say, everyone had to attend, anybody from the rank of major on down. And the core of my lectures revolved around those films that I would show. In some cases, I developed the entire program, the entire lesson. And I would begin by discussing current events. And that's the research that I would do prior to each lecture. And to keep the men informed as to what was happening. And then I would invite questions and try to answer them and try to revolve the lectures around the subject of communism. Ultimately, it would reach, why are we fighting?
Right. Okay. Well, earlier in our interview, you mentioned that you weren't sure why you were fighting. So, did you have to figure that out before you could have these meetings?
Well, I had to act as if I understood.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to go to Korea.
Right.
I was very happy doing what they had me doing. And in fact, it was one of the year of 1953 was one of the happiest years of my life. I met a family in Baltimore. They invited me for dinner one evening. They heard about me from some distant relative. And when I left their house that night, I had a key to their home and a standing invitation to come every weekend if I wanted to. They used to fix me up with dates. I was single at the time. I was 21. And I mean, it was a very pleasant experience that I had. Anyway, I won't go into too much of that, but take my word for it, it was very nice.
Where was, if you don't mind repeating, where was your training based out of? Like, where were you at this time?
Initially, it was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. That's where I went through basic training. And then I was transferred to Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And the unit that I was involved with was actually, it was not even company size as far as numbers are concerned, but it was commanded by a full colonel. Normally, a company is commanded by a lieutenant or a captain at the most, but had a full colonel. The reason is this was a super secret, in those days, a super secret installation. In order to just be a fireman taking care of the building, you had to have a secret clearance. The FBI, I found out, had come to Cape Girardeau and investigated me to approve my credentials. The reason it was super secret is that it was a unit composed of groups of 8 or 9 men, commanded by a warrant officer, which is a much, even though they rank as less than lieutenant, these were very knowledgeable people. And each unit was a unit that maintained anti-aircraft equipment. Have you ever heard of the Honest John rockets? They're heat sensing rockets. Now remember, this is 1953. This was a long time ago in terms of the evolution of our armament and so forth, but they were men in the field who maintained, didn't fire them, but they maintained these rockets, anti-aircraft rocketry. And those are the men that I served with. And we were pretty much isolated from the rest of Aberdeen Proving Grounds.
Through your training for like basic training and on, how were your lieutenants that taught you? Like, were they like mean or?
During basic training, they were tough.
Okay.
Yeah, which, and rightly so. They were training us to kill,
Right.
really. But as far as, and I went through the training shooting an M1 rifle. By the way, I made expert on that.
Okay.
Fortunately, I never had to use it. But there was no training for the job that I subsequently had.
Okay.
It was, I really kind of, I knew what was expected because I had gone through some of these lectures when I was going through basic training. But when I was on the other end and dishing it out, so to speak, no one trained me to do that.
Okay. Do you know anyone, any friends or family that had to go over to Korea?
Had a lot of friends that had to go to Korea.
Were they envious of you getting to stay? And
I don't think I discussed my situation too much with the ones that were in Korea or had to go to Korea. But some of them had harrowing experiences. A fellow from Memphis who I later became very close with, he's since passed away. His name was Charles Steinberg. And he was at the 38th parallel, which is where the fighting was. And he was telling me one day he was eligible to get home, not to go home, but for R&R, to get leave to go into Tokyo, recreation and rehabilitation. I think that's what the R&R stood for. And he was in Korea and he went to the airfield, and just as he was about to get on the plane, they said, "We don't have room for any more." He was the very next person to go. And so he had to wait for another flight, and he was very upset until he found out that that plane that he missed crashed, killed everybody on the plane.
wow.
That's one of 152 stories, true stories, that I compiled in 2 books that I wrote.
What are your books called?
What
are they called?
Well, one of them is called Crossroads, Chance or Destiny. These are all true stories of stories similar to that. People meeting unexpectedly under fortuitous circumstances where their lives were not merely impacted but were saved as a result. One of the stories in my second book, in Crossroads, is about Warren Bashir.
Okay. Well,
He probably has copies of these 2 books of mine the next time you're at their house. When you drop your girlfriend off, go in and tell them you'd like to see those books.
where could we get a copy? Where could the school get a copy?
We have them at the Poplar White Station Library has copies. The main library has copies. I've spoken at all the libraries in Memphis, and 6 or 8 churches, and 4 cruise ships, and I've had a lot of fun out of these books, and their stories kind of similar to the one I just recited. But you can also get them on Amazon.com. If you just type in my name, Harry Samuels, and go to books and hit Crossroads, it'll pull up Crossroads, and the other book is called Beshert, B-E-S-H-E-R-T, which is a word that means fate, destiny, divine providence, inevitability, things that were meant to be, never chance occurrences. But some interesting stories.
It sounds interesting. I'll have to talk to the doctor about getting a couple copies. So, when you were in the war, how did you communicate with friends, family, girlfriends? Stuff?
Mostly letters, postcards.
How long would it take if you wrote one and sent one? How long would it take? How many days would it take for them to receive it and write back?
I would say maybe 4 or 5.
Okay, so.
But I wasn't overseas, so it was just domestic mail.
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, or I use the telephone.
Yeah.
I mean, I told y'all I'm not a very good I'm probably had the most pleasant almost 2 years of service in the armed forces of the United States of anybody that probably has ever lived. It's really embarrassing because I know y'all are looking probably more for dramatic situations, but I'm telling it like it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to get like that side of the war, and even people like.
Well, it was to me a very pleasant experience. I have no complaints.
After the war was over, where did you go?
After it was over, a friend of mine, cousin, and I bought a store in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and we subsequently built another store. And then I brought the idea of a membership department store to Memphis, and the man who was headed the company said, "I'll build a building if you will manage it." And so we came to Memphis and managed these stores. They were, the first store we built was the largest membership department store in the United States. We built it a year before Sam Walton opened the first Walmart. And we didn't have the computer technology that he did later, but it's similar to Costco. The only difference is to be a member of Dixie Mart, you had to, it was like $2, and it required you to be a government employee of some sort. One day, have you ever heard of Kemmons Wilson?
I've not.
Kemmons Wilson was the man that started the Holiday Inn. First, he was the head of Holiday Inns, and he started the whole idea. And I used to play tennis with him. And one day he called, he said, "Harry, my wife would like to come and do some shopping in Dixie Mart. Can I get a card?" I said, "Kemmons, I'm sorry, but you don't qualify for a card." This was a multimillionaire. I said, "You don't qualify." I said, "The man that collects your garbage, he qualifies, but you don't. However, if you want a card, if you'll just have her call me the next time she wants to come, I'll pick her up and bring her to the store." And then after that, in '68, we got out of that business, and my partner and I, a same partner from Jonesboro, we opened a real estate, a commercial real estate company called Samuels and Shaneberg Realtors. And we built some buildings here in Memphis. Have you ever heard of the Poplar Towers building?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
We built that.
That's awesome.
And won the Poplar and the First Memphis Plaza building in Whitehaven. And
Just out of curiosity, have you
Yeah.
ever heard of Wild Smith Drugstore?
of what?
Wild Smith Drugstore?
Wild Smith.
Yeah, that's my grandfather owned a drugstore in Memphis for like 50
We-
years.
These stores that we had in our membership department store, they were all leased departments. And the drug department was out of Kansas City, called Parkview Drugs.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because in those days, a druggist, if he filled 15 prescriptions a day, he was doing a lot of business. We started off in each store, had 4 stores, we were doing 2,000 a day.
Wow.
And it became the largest retail business in the city of Memphis, just very quickly.
That's awesome.
So after you were, like when you were done serving your time in the war as a speaker, I'm guessing since you were already in America, there was no like readjustment time. It didn't seem weird to be done.
There was readjustment because I had had such a wonderful time of it the last year. It was getting adjusted back to normalcy.
Okay, yeah. See, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever met anyone with that kind of readjustment.
You can't imagine. I had these people I stayed with that befriended me. They had a 52-foot Chris Craft on Chesapeake Bay, and I had it at my disposal anytime I wanted it. I used to throw dances, parties on. It was ocean going, had a cap. I mean, it was a tough life, I'm telling you. I wish I could tell you something else, but it wouldn't be true. I mean, I just can't tell you how tough it was, because it wasn't tough for me.
Did you remain in contact with any of the people you spoke to that you might have?
Yeah, one of the fellas, one day I was at Aberdeen Proving Grounds and I decided I wanted to meet some girls. So I got a pass and went into where the University of Maryland is. And I went, I forget the name of it, anyway, went there and I went to a fraternity house. I belonged to a fraternity in college. And I figured, well, I'll meet some guys, maybe meet some girls. Knocked on the door, nobody was there. They had all gone to a football game somewhere. But I walked inside and wrote a couple of despondent letters home. And I just went upstairs and sacked out in somebody's bed. And about 2 hours later, I hear a knocking on the door. And I went downstairs and opened the door. And there was one of my closest friends, a guy I'd gone through 4 years of college with at Washington University. He was living in New York. He was in the Presidential Honor Guard at in Washington. And he had never been to Maryland. College Park is the name of the place. He had never been there, but he went there the same day, the same time, for the same reason. And here we bump into each other. That's also in one of my books.
That's awesome.
But that's one of the persons, and we've been very close. I speak with him every couple of weeks. He lost his wife maybe a month ago. I try to call him every week and keep up with him. But, we're both almost 87 years old. And, but I've kept up with him. And there's another fellow that I was very close with. His name is Sam Fox. He lives in St. Louis, and he's been very successful. In fact, one day I received a ring box, velvet box that normally has jewelry in it. And it had a card, and it had one single cufflink, gold cufflink with a symbol of the United States. And a card that said, "Dear Harry, either lose an arm or come to Brussels for the other one." Brussels, Belgium. He was the United States ambassador to Belgium. And so my wife and I went, it was the most expensive cufflinks I ever bought. But we spent a week in the embassy in Brussels, and we stayed close with him.
How long after you were done with the war did you meet your wife?
I met her, 53. I met her 2 years after I was out of the service.
Okay.
But it didn't really connect with her. Her sister had invited me to be her date. She had a house party. and I knocked on the door, and my wife came to the door, and I thought, I've got a date with the wrong girl, but she was only 17, and I'm 7 years older than she is, so I forgot about her. And one night I was living in Jonesboro, and we were had a church potluck supper. That's a euphemism for poker game and mahjong game. The women played mahjong, the men played poker. And I had just won a pot, not a big pot, but a pot. And I turned to a guy next to me, and I said, "Jack, have you met any cute girls in Memphis lately?" He said, "I double dated with this Flora Shine." I said, "Oh my gosh, I forgot about her." This was 5 years after I met her when she opened the door. And I called her and connected, and that was the last time either of us went out with anyone else. And we've been married 56 years. It will be 57 years in June if she behaves herself.
That's awesome. So you met her after, how old was her sister at the time when you met?
Her sister was she was about 3 years younger than I was. She was around 20, 21, something like that.
Okay. So just reflecting on your time in the war, is there any message that you'd like to give to anybody that
Prospective person going in? Yeah, I would recommend one thing. Try to keep your sense of humor. Try to absorb everything that they teach you, because you never know when it's going to be needed or come in handy. But try to maintain a positive attitude, one that looks on there's a lot of humor involved. If you can kind of remove yourself from the immediate situation mentally and think, boy, 20 years from now I'm going to be laughing over this situation. It may sound serious now, but I don't know if I'm expressing myself properly, but I tried to look at it from a humor standpoint, and I found lots of humor. If I'd kept notes, I could have written a book about it. But that would be my advice, because when you're in the service, you don't have much choice. You're directed by everybody, especially when you're a private like I was when starting off. But met some wonderful people, enlisted men and officers. And there was one officer that met me during basic training, and we became such good friends. He and two other lieutenants, I was a private at the time, they used to dress in civilian clothes, and I would too, and they would take me to, outside in their car for pizza and so on. And one of them asked me to be in his bridal party in Atlantic City, and I did. I was in his bridal party.
So how would you say, compared to our views of the war and being that we don't have the information that you have, how did the war impact your view on wars and battles?
Well, directly, I was isolated. I was insulated because I was having too much fun in Baltimore, just to be honest. But I had friends who were over there, and I was fearful for their lives. It was a bad situation. I don't know how many men I think we lost, about 50,000 men? Is that about right? It was a horrible, horrible situation. And so I was fearful for them. It impacted me in that sense. as far as me, I was just extremely fortunate, really, that I met this Captain Fleming.
Yeah.
If not for him, I could have been instead of being here, I would have been a casualty that you'd be reading about. But
When did Captain Fleming pass?
I'd say probably 20 years ago.
Did you attend his funeral?
I'm sorry?
Did you attend his funeral?
No, I didn't know that he had died
Oh, okay.
till much later, through his cousin here in Memphis.
Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you'd like to touch on?
No, I wish, as I say, I'm almost embarrassed not being able to provide you with the sort of farmer service person that you're really looking for, that your teacher was looking for. But I had to be honest with you.
Oh, no, this is
And I told Mr. Bashir, I told him the same thing. Initially, I said, Warren, I'll be glad to help these people if they're interested in my story, but my story is not a typical story of people serving in the armed forces. So in that sense, I regret that I can't tell you of battles fought and.
This is actually probably better than most other groups because for us to see the different side of it and like not all about shooting and all that stuff, but more of the like inside and what
Right.
you did. That was great.
Well, I've shared with you some intimate things, not all the intimate things, but a lot of them. And you can't, if you're ever drafted, God forbid, into the service, don't expect the same kind of situation. Prepare yourself for the worst and enjoy the best.
If you don't mind, I missed a part that I was supposed to touch on. Would you state your full name?
Oh, Harry Samuels, Samuels.
And then what the year you were born?
I was born in 1931,
Thank you.
which means I'll be 87 in May.
Same age as my grandfather.
Oh. Is he the one who was in the drug business?
No, that's on my other side.
Oh,
But my grandfather was actually a pilot in around.
World War II,
No, it was later.
Korean.
It was around there, but he didn't do any major things. He got hijacked in the Cuban Missile Crisis, though.
Oh,